English at Washington State University, and the author of William Blake and the Digital Humanities, Collaboration, Participation, and Social Media, published by Routledge in 2013. And this is the first ever Romantic Circles Reviews and Reception book chat. Before we get to our guest and discussion today, I'd like to take a moment and explain exactly what this is. I'm an associate editor of the new Romantic Circles Reviews and Reception. We're scheduled to go live on September 1st with the intention of exploiting the advantages of social media to rethink the genre of journal reviews. One of the ways we're doing this is by creating a series of hangout book chats on new Romantic scholarship of note. We have a whole slate of new material that will soon appear on the site. I don't want to say too much about it so we don't spoil the surprise, and because it's due to the efforts of my other associate editors. But look for some big changes on the Romantic Circles review page coming soon. Today we're discussing Evan Gottlieb's Romantic Globalism, British Literature and the Modern World Order, 1715 to 1830, published in 2014 by Ohio State University Press. I've wanted to read this book ever since it was first published because it really challenges some of the work in British Romanticism regarding many things like post-colonial studies, nationalism, the Gothic, the history of capitalism, and even media studies, which is of particular interest to me. I want to thank the panelists for joining me, and especially Evan for agreeing to be my guinea pig on this new adventure. Discussing this book with me today are Siobhan Carroll, an associate professor of English at the University of Delaware, where she teaches courses on 19th century literature and science fiction. Her first book, An Empire of Air and Water, Uncolonializable Space in the British Imagination, 1750 to 1850, describes the relevance of uncolonializable geographies such as the North Pole and the atmosphere to British imperialism. Her current book project examines the relationship between human agency and nature in the long 19th century. James Mulholland is an associate professor of English at North Carolina State University. His book, Sounding Imperial, Poetic Voice and the Politics of Empire, 1730 to 1820, was published in 2013 by Johns Hopkins University Press. His next book explores the emergence of Anglo-Indian literature and the colonial public sphere in India during the late 18th century. And Miranda Burgess is an associate professor of English at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She's author of British Fiction and the Production of Social Order, 1740 to 1830, published by Cambridge University Press, and a number of articles about the history of literary form and romantic mobilities. And last, but certainly not least, Evan Gottlieb is associate professor of English at Oregon State University. He is author, editor, or co-editor of 7 books, including Feeling British, Sympathy and National Identity in Scottish and English Writing, 1707 to 1832, Walter Scott and Contemporary Theory, and the new Norton Critical edition of Tobias Smollett's The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker. He's currently completing Romantic Realities, Speculative Realism, and British Romanticism, forthcoming from Edinburgh University Press. So, a bit about the format for those of you who are joining us. I'm going to allow Evan about 5 minutes to discuss his book, including any changes or amendments he would have made since it was published last year. Then we go to each of our panelists in the order I introduced them. They'll give a 5-minute statement about the book, including their impressions and any initial questions. Evan will then have 10 minutes to respond to the statements, after which I'll open up to a more free-flowing Q&A and discussion session. Depending on who is in the audience, we might even take questions in the chat box. So, let's go with Evan.
All right. You guys can hear me?
Yes. And one thing,
Okay.
by the way, guys, remember to mute your mic if you're not speaking at that moment. Thanks.
Well, first of all, let me just say a big thank you to Roger and the other panelists. This is a real pleasure and a real privilege, and I just am very appreciative of you all for having taken the time to do this, and to Roger for coming up with this innovative format that I think is really promising. So yes, the book. Here it is. Grew out of my first book, The Feeling British, and was about that first book was about, of course, national identity and the English and Scottish learning to think of themselves as British together. In the course of which, especially as I was finishing that, I began thinking about the fact that clearly the English and the Scots were simultaneously not beginning to think about themselves in relation to the rest of the world. British national identity, in other words, was being forged through exogamous as well as endogamous relations. And really so the book partially sprung from that and my recognition that there was a lot in outside of feeling British that wasn't that I couldn't cover in that book, and then of course the events of September 11th, 2001 happened while I was finishing that first book, finishing the dissertation, and so of course I began thinking, as many of us did, I think about globalization. As a phenomenon that has a much longer history than merely the sort of mid-20th century. Right, the sort of most basic definition of globalization that was the springboard for the book, globalization as the compression of time and space, thanks to the increased circulation of goods, people, and money around the globe, is clearly a process, right? Not simply a contemporary state of affairs. And so the earliest part of the book that I wrote was actually the part from chapter 4 on Scott's The Talisman. I've done a lot of work on Scott and have a great fondness for him. I had read The Talisman actually back in graduate school. Couldn't really use it, I found, for feeling British and for my dissertation. But with all the talk of clash of civilizations following 9/11 and the pushback from scholars like Said and Amartya Sen, suddenly Scott's novel of the Crusades seemed incredibly timely again, precisely because it provided a model that was not a clash of civilizations model, in my opinion, that was more sophisticated, more nuanced, and more sympathetic than that. So that was the sort of starting point for the book that became Romantic Globalism. I want to say a few other short things, quick things about it. One of the terms that was most useful for me and that sort of steered my thinking throughout is the term the global imaginary, which was developed by the political scientist Manfred Steger. Steger is obviously adapting Charles Taylor's concept of the social imaginary. So in a way, the question that the book sets out to answer, hopefully coherently, is, was there a romantic global imaginary? And if so, of what was it composed? And so I came to think that although there was this generally overlooked phenomenon of romantic globalism that was alive and well during the period between the end of the American Revolution and the rise of the Second British Empire in the East, it seemed to me that there was a kind of mutation, to use the Foucauldian phrase, that took place around the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And so those wars and sort of, the Synecdoche of 1815 becomes the kind of fulcrum on which the critical narrative that I tell in the book shifts. Before the wars, Britain is just another sort of middling power off the coast of Europe. After 1815, Britain emerges as something akin to a global superpower. And that's the conceptual movement from the sympathetic cosmopolitanism of the early chapters to the global hospitality of the later chapters. The book's title is clearly meant to register both a debt and a difference from Sari McDeasy's 1998 book, Romantic Imperialism. And that book was hugely influential on me and on many others too, and rightly so. But in the course of formulating my ideas about how Britons, especially in the Romantic era, were thinking about their relations to others around the planet, I came to think that McDeasy had been too quick to label the Romantics imperialists. I think post-colonial theory has been incredibly productive in Romantic studies, but my book does set out to suggest that it doesn't and can't tell the whole story. That there were writers. It makes post-colonial theory applied to the Romantic era makes some assumptions that I came to question. For example, a number of prominent historians, and this is part of the work that I do in the introduction, have argued that the British Empire was a lot less monolithic, a lot less coherent in practice than it was in the discourse of its supporters and its detractors, both during and after. People like C.A. Bailey and John Bellich, the so-called sort of Cambridge school, are arguing that talking of the British Empire as something that existed separately from the dynamics of globalization is misleading, and especially to talk of the British Empire as a coherent and functioning whole prior to the mid-19th century is particularly misleading. To put this another way, instead of treating globalization as the latest manifestation of Western imperialism, which is certainly how most left-wing critics of globalization frame it, and I'm somewhat sympathetic to that view, I wanted to see what we could learn from seeing imperialism as one phase of long-durational globalization, rather than vice versa. And so I realized that I would be somewhat at odds with post-colonialists, and somewhat at odds with leftist critics of globalization today, and I felt like that these were risks worth taking in order to see the macro politics of the Romantic era with fresh eyes. All right, let me wrap this up by saying that the book is admittedly far from comprehensive. I wrote it with the hope that others would take up some of the same themes. I'm glad to say that's already happening. All three of you here today are part of that. Whether you were, some of you, of course, writing independently of this book as well, of course. In particular, I want to say I'm quite conscious of the fact that the book is missing any sustained consideration of slavery and any consideration of non-European global imaginaries, both of which are absolutely important for a full picture. I'm also aware that it's missing any engagement with several important Romantic era poets who wrote consistently about other cultures, especially Southey and Percy Shelley. Blake is also missing in action, as I'm sure Roger noticed. And finally, let me just say, on the critical theoretical side of things, I regret not being able to take into account the ideas of a number of authors whose books were published or translated too late for me to use. James's work, I could only briefly mention it, sounding imperial, and James has a great piece in Representing Place. Miranda and her work, and all the contributors, in fact, to the Global Romanticism collection were extraordinarily helpful and enlightening. And I also wanted to say that two theorists, in particular, whom were I to rewrite Romantic Globalism now, I would want to make much better use of. Peter Sloterdijk, his In the World Interior of Capital and his Spheres trilogy, more generally, developed this really compelling, idiosyncratic blend of materialist determinism and psychological mutation to account for global human planetary relations. And also, I'm sorry if I mispronounced his name, Kojin Karatani's The Structure of World History, a book that I didn't know about when I was writing Romantic Globalism, that I think really would have provided a helpful supplement to the world systems theory that I do employ in the book. And I'll stop there.
All right, why don't we go with Siobhan?
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that explanation and sort of recounting of the process of you composing this book, Evan. Personally, I just found even that fascinating, and I've got a whole bunch of questions I want to ask you, but before that, I'll begin with sort of a statement on some of my takeaways from this. It was interesting that you cast this as I think you saw it as slightly more combative regarding post-colonial theory than I think I necessarily do, but not that it doesn't make an intervention. But I think for myself, I've just read Caroline Levine's Forms. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name right, but I found that a really fascinating book, and I recommend it as sort of one for people to check out. And so I was reading this Romantic Globalism on a rereading it, I should say, through that lens, and thinking about the ways that your term, Romantic Globalism, describes a slightly different pattern of philosophical, social, and literary organization than nationalism or imperialism in very valuable ways. So it's a term that allows us to approach moments of global contemplation in which authors try to situate Britain in relation to an abstract globe, as well as representations of international encounters that, as you're alluding to, Evan, don't quite replicate the anticipated power relations of colonized or British Protestant versus continental other. And for me, I think in the book, your reading of Laura in particular highlighted and provided a good example of the ways that a global lens for that text brought other elements to the fore. It highlights the oddity of its main character, a Byronic wanderer who doesn't exist in an imperial relation to the Orient, and nor does he function, I think, as an effective cosmopolitan, since he proves unable to leave his Oriental affiliations behind. This is someone who's tied to place in a very sympathetic way, and to people, and can't sort of detach and become a free wanderer in a way that we might cynically expect if we're seeing cosmopolitanism there constructed in a cynical way. An imperial reading might try to frame this text and Lara as a failed colonizer, someone who's in fact been colonized by the place that he came to claim. But I would agree with your reading that that would seem to misrepresent the poem's sympathy for this figure and his Oriental lover. So for me, that was an example of a reading of a text that really highlighted the possibilities of this approach. I'm going to just sort of add as an aside that if we think of this, if we think of globalism or globalization as one form, one sort of apparent or available system of organizing and representing relations to the world, then I think it's just sort of interesting to note that, of course, the literary texts here are also forms of are also themselves sort of forms that are wandering globally. The novel, of course, as you allude to later with Walter Scott, in the case of Lara, in a way that poem itself is replicate in the level of form is itself an Eastern wanderer. If we buy into the notion that the epic poem, originates in ancient Greece, that has in fact sort of come west and has been hybridized and is being presented to a domestic audience that might not be willing to fully accept it. I wonder if, in other words, there's another dimension yet still to that poem that you could pull out. But from my own perspective, coming with an interest in the history of space and exploration, I was really struck by that opening anecdote where you're talking about Coleridge gloomily contemplating a Britain whose natural limits, having first been breached by Britain's involvement in the slave trade, now stand permeable to Napoleonic invasion. Now, of course, this fretting over the island nation's loss of integrity was not uncommon in the period. Neither was the sort of deployment of Napoleon as an avatar of a kind of a negative globalization or incipient globalization. That is to say, a figure who has a role as a destroyer of nations and a builder of supranational European community. But I found myself, given my own preoccupations, musing over Coleridge's invocation of the natural borders of Britain, as it represented a different kind of globalizing move than you trace elsewhere, an appeal not to universal human nature, but to inhuman nature's role in figuring or disintegrating human communities. And this, in turn, I think, leads me to a set of questions that I was musing over as I thought about preparing for this talk, and that was, what are the spaces, then, of globalism? And I have queries here on globalism as opposed to cosmopolitanism, and I was hoping later in the talk we might be able to tease those out more. But I admit, when I contemplate romantic globalism, as you've defined it in this book, that is to say, not only an attempt to imagine the Romantic's relationship to global processes, but to imagine that relationship in an egalitarian way. I find myself envisioning it being born and articulated in spaces that lend themselves to a kind of distant reading of the human race, so the study with a globe in front of you, as opposed to the kinds of spaces where one's on shipboard, for example, on a beach like the one that Byron describes in the Ireland, where you're more in contact with what Spivak would call the planetary, that is to say, the natural system in the register of alterity, as opposed to the global system of human communication on which time-space compression sort of relies. And yet I can think of texts like Mary Shelley's Last Man, for example, with its vision of an intertwined humanity being destroyed worldwide like airborne plague that testifies with a kind of cynical apocalypticism to a common bare life of the human race as experienced in that planetary register. And so that for me was something I kept thinking about as I was reading this. How is nature, outside of the sort of abstract state of nature, how is actual ecological material nature perhaps functioning either in representations in these texts or for some of these thinkers to shape their idea of global interaction? And then I was also wondering about different kinds of spaces and how they shape people's interactions. To take, for example, your notion of Walter Scott's global hospitality, well, there's a term that sort of implies a domestic space, and I think some sort of counter-arguments might argue that that's implying, in fact, and replicating a series of imperial controls. So what you're in saying, well, we should be extending hospitality, there's in fact a kind of a subtle enforcement of a set of power relations in which one person's the host and the other person's the guest. I was wondering if you saw global hospitality functioning in that way and whether it was confined to certain spaces. I was also wondering whether certain characters like Byron's Lara embody a kind of cosmopolitan transferability, or whether they were biologically as well as psychologically tied to certain landscapes. And I was also wondering whether the triumph over Montesquieu's empire of climate was imagined as complete in these works. So that's a whole set of questions, and I don't anticipate we'll get to all of them, but that's certainly what came to mind for me.
Great. James.
Hello. I also wanted to say thanks to Roger, to you for setting this up. I think it is a fabulous format, and I'm really pleased to be here talking with everyone and hearing what everyone has to say about Evan's excellent book. I wanted to start by just contributing a few overall reactions to the disciplinary, professional, and theoretical consequences of the arguments that are made in this book. And I want to announce myself from the outset as primarily a scholar of the Anglophone 18th century, and I don't really do that out of a kind of testimonial impulse, but because I think Evan's book was also interested in raising questions about contracted and dilated intellectual periods. So for example, I found it to be really useful when he mentioned from the outset that he thought of many Romantic authors as fundamentally anchored in the literary and conceptual debates of 18th century Britain, a position that I subscribe to as well. So many of these reflections are kind of the vantage from which I'm approaching this book. And with that in mind, I wanted to make three primary points, with Evan's concluding injunction that he hopes scholars will use this book. Each of these points pertains to what he calls on page 6 the macro politics of Romanticism, which I think is a really useful phrase, and I really like that idea of macro politics. And also the idea of the emergence of a romantic globalism whose authors, as he writes on page 10, encouraged readers to adopt a recognizably modern global mindset. So the first point is really about periodization, literary evolution, and the uses of genre and chronology. I thought one of the most fascinating moments of the book occurred near the end, Evan, when you suggested something explicitly that I think you had been hinting at throughout the book, and it really concerned the relations of the material that you'd collected as your evidence. So you offer this idea on page 151 that the book follows from poetry to the novel as a kind of chronology and as a kind of aesthetic succession, and that this evolution is intimately tied to romantic globalism. And I think one really useful thing for us to do would be to consider the formal and generic properties, in a way I think, Shimon, you were just talking about, of romantic globalism. This is a book that's primarily organized into chapters gathered around sets of authors, but it seems to me that this might be one really important and continuous undercurrent of the book, both about the themes and concepts that are being discussed and about how the book is organized overall. This related to my second overall point, which has to do with the book's engagement with questions of mediation. Early in his book, Evan writes that Romantic era globalization was, as he says on page 15, much more explicitly mediated than today's version. I think this would be enormously useful to explore and maybe even to challenge a little bit. My initial reaction to that claim was to wonder how much different that mediation was. What are the qualities of this difference? Now, one answer might be simply that the Romantic period has different mediating technologies, and different mediating technologies that are primary. I don't think anybody would really debate that. The second, I think, also, though, relates to the idea of mediation and speed, that those media technologies in the Romantic period don't create the same collapse of distance or the same immediacy, if we want to use that word, as media technologies that are dependent on electricity do. So some shorthand with this would be something like electricity is faster than paper. So when Evan suggests, following the inspiration of Peter Wagner, Cliff Siskin, and William Warner, that globalization may be one or several events in a longer history of mediation, I couldn't help but wonder, with way, way too much cleverness, whether this could be reversed, whether this formulation could be reversed. Whether, in fact, mediation is a part of one of the several shifts of the long history of globalization. This is really just a plea, I think, for us to follow more fully not just the themes and rhetorical tropes that you describe in your book, but also the media types and formal features that come out as well of the material that you're talking about in Romantic Globalism. And then there's even some connection and attachment between that idea and my third point, which is really about the terminology and the categorizations that the book asks us to consider, particularly about the globe, globalism, and globalization. Now, this has been talked about for decades, but was really, for me, considered with renewed force with the examples from Byron and the wide range of locations that are represented as in poems and plays that seem to me to include Greece, Syria, the remote Pacific of Fletcher Christian and the Bounty Mutineers. It raised a lot of questions. For example, to what extent are we obligated to be precise about place? And this might be a question that's kind of conjoined with, Siobhan, your question about whether or how we should talk about space. As we are precise about place, how much are we able to generalize about globalism? Is globalism a generalization? I struggle with this a lot, and I think it's one of the underlying intellectual struggles of the book as well. One way to think of this is to use comparison, as Evan does, for example, between Walter Scott and Byron, and how they pursue different forms of romantic globalism in different ways. I think this comes back to some of the ideas of evolution and chronology as well. But I was also wondering if we might think of what they do in these different instances, not as globalism, but maybe rather as some other things, perhaps a kind of super-regionalism, or as regional interconnection, or as translocally linked locations themselves detached from the demands of nation-states, and maybe instead lodged in other geographical units, cities, provinces, unincorporated territory. To me, this means that Evan's book is really pressing issues about the temporal and spatial scales of global thought, encouraged, as he says, by representations of the literary works that he's examined. So if global thinking is an alternative to our scholarly conceptions of colonialism and imperialism, I think as you've eloquently stated, perhaps globalism is a historical alternative to the contemporary logic of globalization, while also at the same time being an alternative to some of the other forms for how we organize the globe, or how the globe was thought to be organized during the Romantic period. And I think pursuing the consequences of this, as Evan asked us to do in his conclusion, would be a really useful aftermath for the book's publication. Thanks.
Great. Miranda.
Well, like my colleagues, I'd really like to thank you, Roger, for convening this session in this very new and kind of exciting dialogical format. And Evan, I'd also really like to appreciate your book and thank you for being here to discuss it with us. I found it a pleasure to read, in particular because I found the parameters of your intervention laid out extremely clearly and provocatively in that introduction. And I think what I'd like to do in my response to the book is to start with some of the most explicit claims that you, Evan, make in the introduction, and try to think about, how they shape my understanding of the book and how I might respond to them. So I was hoping and preparing for this that we wouldn't all end up saying things that overlapped, and in fact we haven't done. I've heard with interest everything that my colleagues have said and been very engaged by their thoughts about the book. The matters that I want to bring up, I think, haven't been raised yet as explicitly as I'm going to raise them. And so jumping off from James's comments about mediation, I'm going to want to consider the question of literary form a little bit and a kind of theory of literary form in the making of this book. I'd also like to think about pedagogy and ethics. So those are the major shapes of my response as I'm about to unfold it here. The book advances two main theses. One, that British writers not only encouraged their readers to think globally during the Romantic period, but also strove to explore the ethical imperatives of such thinking. So this is page 2 and 3 in the book. The idea of encouraging readers to think, and some relation between that encouraging readers to think and an exploration of ethical imperatives is the two major threads in the founding of this emergent global imaginary. This emphasis in the introduction meant that for me the Byron and Scott chapters were incredibly productive. Like Siobhan, I loved the reading of Lara. I really appreciate its implicit unfolding of a kind of queer globality. Byron's condemnation, Evan says on page 104, of a society that can make no space in itself for otherness. This seemed to me incredibly productive to think about, maybe in relation to ideas like Lee Edelman's No Future, as perhaps even advancing a kind of a counter-ethic to some of the other lines that are unfolded in the book. I would have really loved to hear more about that queerness. And then the incredible close reading of Scott's Talisman and Anne of Geerstein that are on display in the Scott chapter. And that's kind of where I'd like to focus in with more detail for a couple of moments. So the pedagogical understanding of Romantic writing in this book is very prominent. It's what the introduction calls, quote, a commitment, implicit or explicit, to teach readers to think globally in ways that emphasize the horizontality, transversality, or mutually constitutive nature of the relations between people and nations. I really like the demand side analysis here, the commitment to the notion that books finally are for readers. And I also wonder whether this pedagogical reading is or can be specific to Romantic literature, or to the set of texts discussed here, and how one might do more to theorize or otherwise account for the specificity of this approach. For example, the reading of Radcliffe, which finds in her novels, it's a remedial reading of Radcliffe that undoes the conservative and xenophobic Radcliffe we find so often in criticism. Evan says that he, quote, finds in Radcliffe's novels not paranoid invocations of foreign lands and peoples in the service of fear-mongering nationalism, but mostly moderate and reasoned representations of continental nations and creeds, inhabited and traversed by characters who at their best demonstrate highly ethical forms of sympathy, cosmopolitanism, and tolerance in the face of suffering and fear. This is page 48. So this is a reading of the pedagogy of a novel that focuses very firmly on characters and what characters do and how characters are represented. But no theory of character is explicitly unfolded, and yet it seems to be implicit throughout this book in ways that would bear more thinking about. The book comes closest to elaborating a theory of character in the chapter of Scott, and I love this chapter. I thought it was the strongest in the book because of this more elaborate account of character as a literary form. Here, Evan reads the multiple frames and narrative masks and feints that surround Scott's novels, particularly the late novels, as a, quote, self-splitting that, quote, corresponds to the modern post-Enlightenment subject, as Zizek theorizes it. That is, a subject whose, quote, sense of self depends on identification, not with the state and its positivity, but rather with the violence of state-sanctioned power in its negative form. this is a trade-off of personal subjectivity for the capacity to, quote, productively inhabit the realm of homogeneity and equivalence. This is sort of pages 126 to 128. I'm a little troubled by the emphasis on productivity, I guess, and the implicit dialectical swing from something approaching bare life to ethical subjectivity, which I'd like to come back to. But even so, it seems to me that there's an account here of what narrative form can do in pedagogy, in ethical pedagogy, and particularly in relation to globality, that I would love to see made even more explicit than it begins to be in the Scott chapter. I think without a more elaborate theory of character and even more of narrative pedagogy, the risk of an argument like this is conflating representation with tutelage, claiming that anything shown, or in the dialogic narrative works that are the focus here, anything put into the mouths of appealing or narratively approved characters is necessarily being inculcated. And for the most part, I'm not sure this is what the end of the book is. But when I saw that the book closed with Martha Nussbaum's Not-for-Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities, a work that Evan says resembles the Shelleyan vision of literature as a vehicle for enhancing one's abilities to feel authentically and deeply connections to and with others. This is at the end of the book on page 153. I wondered if, in fact, this is the claim that's being made, that the work of characters is necessarily to do ethical work, that the approval or disapproval of them is absolutely fundamental to the way narrative literature functions. And if this is the reason why this book is so strongly narrative, even in its choices of the poems that it wants to explore. So that's one set of questions and one set of responses that I have. The other has to do with the notion of ethics, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am to read a book on romantic globality and incipient understandings of the world as a global space that takes up the ethical rather than simply the political or the economic. I was just absolutely delighted to see this. And of course, I look for certain names in the unfolding of this conversation. Jonathan Israel, Salah Ben-Habib, Derrida, you know, these names are kind of here, and I would expect to see that here. What surprised me and what I found kind of productive, and I think I'm a little skeptical about it actually, but I could be convinced, is the emphasis on ethics coupled with the genealogy that so strongly emphasizes the Scottish Enlightenment. You argue, Evan, that Scott's novels propound global hospitality, a formal acceptance of otherness that holds out the possibility of greater accord between individuals as well as nations without eliding their differences. And I think there's a fabulous case for how that works in Scott. The reading of Scott is just absolutely tremendous in this regard. To make this case, Evan turns in the book to Derrida and Ben-Habib, and also to Kantian cosmopolitanisms and the notion of a perpetual peace, which of course in one way can be understood to emerge from the work of Smith and more distantly of Hume. So that the Kant who's on offer here is really the Kant whose idealism is in dialogue with and an outcome of Scottish Enlightenment empiricism. In making this case, the book takes on very quickly Jonathan Israel, suggesting that Israel's reading of Hume, Smith, Miller, and Kames as, quote, essentially conservative is incorrect or inadequate, that rather these Enlightenment figures in their speculative histories take up a position, albeit from an economic rather than a moral or ontological standpoint, essentially similar to that of Israel's radical anti-imperial Enlightenment. And I'm quoting from page 163, note 46. But there's a complete, Spinoza is, I think, almost completely absent from this book. And it feels to me that the other, if you're going to talk about Kantian ethics and the global, the other absolutely crucial route to that is through Spinoza. And then the aftermath leads to Levinas, who is obviously really important for Derrida and Ben-Habib, and problematically important. I think about Ben-Habib's debates with Judith Butler about the nature of hospitality, for example. It's especially clear in the readings of Hume and Smith here that the book wants to recover an ethical core in commerce, and that older idea of commerce as exchange and egalitarian exchange. And it's here for me that some of these other ideas about, on the one hand, Spinozan ideals about interconnectedness, on the other hand, the problems of slavery and bare life and uneven development. It feels to me as though these are lurking around the borders of the argument and longing to be acknowledged, to be brought in and diffused and raised as problems that might complicate some of these claims about the, quote, egalitarian, even idealistic tenor of later romantic globalism that are made here. I guess it feels to me as though the move from anti-imperialist laissez-faire in Hume and Smith to a groundwork for idealism takes place very quickly, and I would love to hear in future work the more nuanced and combative version of that story. So that's sort of my initial responses to this book, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to take part in the conversation about it.
Great. Three really amazing responses. Evan, I see you furiously scribbling notes. Would you like to start, or would you like a second?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I'm still trying to catch up with the last of Miranda's wonderful comments there. All I want to say to everybody is thank you for taking the time to read my book with such intelligence and even sympathy. Yes, I want to say a provisional yes to just about everything. I'm humbled and very much interested in every comment that's been made. It's I think a sort of thread that it seems to me combines what you all have been saying in terms of where you wish the book had done some more work, has to do with, in one way or another, with the question of form. And I think that's right on, because I agree. The book, given the long gestational period that it had, it still feels to me like it is in that sort of discourse studies mode to a large degree that was very much sort of my graduate training. And a training that while I think is useful, I think many of us who were in graduate school in the 90s are also now beginning to feel need supplementation, whether it's through the sort of increased attention to form or genre, or to go back to Siobhan's initial comments, to the material world and James, the media, the media through which discourses are articulated and travel. I'm acutely aware of wanting to do more work in that direction, and so can only plead that Carolyn Levine's book, for instance, is on my bookshelf, waiting to be read at some point. Unfortunately, the summer weeks are draining away rapidly. But a number of people have recommended that book, and clearly she has her finger on the pulse of the new formalism, or after the new formalism, if we're already moving past that. I also I'm glad that people want to press me on some of the distinctions that I try, perhaps only with partial success, to make and then also to maintain throughout the book. I did want to. I mean, I think the biggest distinction that I wanted to make, and it sounds like I was successful, was a distinction between globalization and globalism, right? And making a case for some of these romantics as providing not simply a knowledge of this sort of planetary movement towards greater connections but also a perspective on it, right? And that is the globalism, which is to say that they were proponents of a certain kind of globalization. But this is where Miranda's comments are really key, that the globalism that they were, that I wanted, that I saw these authors, and I should say that, I mean, Miranda, you picked up on a really fascinating point when you noted how narratively driven my choices of texts were. I was less, so even the poetry, I was less aware of that than I was of how popular most of these authors were. That to the extent that that the book assembles a kind of non-canonical group of core romantics, they were the popular ones, and even to the extent that Byron, is or is not sort of the high romantic group. He was by far, of course, except for Scott, the best-selling poet of the whole era. So I really I was thinking more along the lines of being able to make an argument about the ways in which they were reaching large audiences and large readerships, rather than thinking about other points of connection between their work. But I'm very glad to hear that there's more to it, and that I need to think more about globalization and in terms of its formal features, its media features, and certainly I think my own dissatisfaction with the diffuseness of the global imaginary as a working concept has led me towards more materialist kinds of work more recently, at the expense, however, of the political, the sort of sharp political and historical focus that this book tries to create. I feel like I skipped one thing. I think I want to address something that Miranda said near the end of her comments, that the move from the Scottish Enlightenment paradigms of globalization as emerging from laissez-faire economics to ethics is made too quickly, or is not developed well enough in the book. I think that's a fair criticism, but I want to defend the move, not the fact that it's not fleshed out well enough. That's not perhaps defensible. But certainly, I do think that for the Scottish Enlighteners, that line between economics and ethics that seems sort of more established to us, at least from a disciplinary sense, was of course not one that would have been particularly meaningful to them. In other words, the kinds of claims that Hume and Smith make for the ways in which, say, nations from the start are defined by their trade and commerce with other nations was always, I think, an ethical argument for them. And maybe that's something that I could bring out a bit more. I guess I was not. I didn't feel as though there was a shift from a sort of purely economic discourse of the Scottish Enlighteners to the discourse of say, hospitality in Derrida and Ben Habib that was. I felt like there was more continuity there, perhaps, and maybe I was making assumptions that need to be worked out more fully. The case of Spinoza missing in action is partially due simply to my own inability to write intelligently about him, and partially because I remain unclear as to what extent his ideas were well known to the Romantics, and this is something I really would like to know more about this. What little I found was inconclusive, and so I went with the sure bet of Kant, because I was trying to make an argument that had a kind of historical influence to it, rather than and then that's the argument that led, therefore, to the Derridian engagement that is not really the Levinasian one. I'm going to stop there. Again, let me just say finally that I'm just grateful to the three of you for your fantastic thoughts on this that will have me thinking for a long time to come, and again to Roger for assembling this group.
Great, thank you, Evan. So, do we have any follow-ups from the reviewers from the other responses, or from Evan's response? And they don't have to be like as thought out as your first review, but just thoughts or questions.
Oh, I want to add one more thing. Tambora. And Siobhan, I'm sure you're aware of Gillen Wood's new book, which in fact I should just say, and this is a sort of shameless plug for this really excellent, I won't call it a companion volume because so many of these essays in the Global Romanticism collection that I edited that came out with Bucknell, including Miranda's amazing work in there, really take the idea of romantic globalism in so many fascinating directions, and in ways that I could only imagine will be productive. Gillen actually was slated to have part of the Tambora book appear in this collection, and unfortunately had to pull it near the end because his book was being published too quickly for it to appear here. But I'm very aware of that again, the missing sort of geophysical component of globalism, and of course the eco-critical components of globalization that are more or less absent from my book, and that I think present one among several really compelling areas for more work. And I have not finished reading your book, Siobhan, I'm sad to say, even though I'm supposed to have finished it but now. But what I've read so far is fabulous, and I love the way that you are taking a different approach from mine, but one that I think in many ways is conducive to more work. Finally, I just, one more thing that I wanted to think of that I didn't say earlier is that, James, I really appreciate what you said about the sort of the periodization that is, of course, an implicit part of the work of the book, and one that I'm glad for people like you who are doing work that sort of also, of course, treat the long 18th century as a continuum rather than a series of sort of strict divisions. You've done a great job, James, in your book and in your other work of developing the translocal as another way to rethink nationalism and colonialism and imperialism, to provide us with more supple and more nuanced ways of thinking about these kinds of planetary relations. I do think that if there's a term that I'm least wedded to, it's cosmopolitanism. But again, I know there are moments in the book, especially early on with my sort of alternative reading of Radcliffe, where I felt that was useful, but ultimately I'm much more. I think personally, I'm more committed to globalism, which is that hideous. What do you call those words where you combine them? And then translocalism all seem to me to be more promising avenues for really trying to unpick and provide ways of thinking. I mean, I hope I was pretty shameless about trying to say that, for me, this project and the work that all of us are doing is not simply sort of historical recovery for its own sake, although I think that's valuable, but very much because we're in the midst of this. we're in the midst of this long durational process, and if anything if we can learn anything without doing violence to the historical specificity of those other moments, if there's things worth recovering there that can provide us with alternative cognitive frameworks for what we're doing today, then I'm all for it.
I guess maybe I'll add some things just to extend, Evan, what you were saying, and Miranda, one of the points that you made. In a very pointed way, the question seems to keep coming back to, at least in my mind, two kind of related methods and goals of literary study, which is something like, what is it that we think texts and reading do to answer some of the things, Evan, that you were just talking about? What is the relationship between the current moment? I mean, are we in a current moment? I mean, you make a compelling argument, I think, as all of us would, that there is a continuity here between what we can see in the texts from the Romantic period and their global imaginary and its usefulness for our own current moment. It'd be interesting to try to falsify that and think, like, actually, no, there's a radically different connection. Media has changed to such an extent that there's actually some sort of fissure or schism or something like that, or what we need to do is, it's not to do violence to it, but to understand its radical alterity to what we would do now. I'm not committed to that as a position, but I think whatever it is, it raises a question about what methods we want to adopt and what consequences they will have for the kind of knowledge that we can produce. This is, I think, I'm extremely cognizant of this right now because I'm in a project that I think, much as many of you, I'm thinking about, like, what are the material realities, the infrastructure, as I'm calling it now, of those distribution networks, say, in one part of the globe that's occupied by people that we call British, but many of whom are born in India. And how does that relate to, then, the kind of reading, Miranda, that you were talking about? Like, what is the role of representation in tutelage? I think that's an extremely astute way to think about what reading does, combining that, Evan, with your comment that you're noting how popular all the work was that you're writing about, almost as if for us to say that's a different mode of value than the one that we typically use as literary scholars, where we have, I don't know what it is, innovation, evolution, literary history. Like, we have different ways in which we organize text and make them valuable, and that informs the methods that we use. We might actually here be talking about the fact that we need new kinds of methods to describe new kinds of relations of spaces and the ways in which readers use text to understand those different kinds of spaces.
I just wanted to add, as the host, I guess, I don't know, that off of James' comment, because it was really fascinating. I was actually reading this book in tandem with Matt Jockers' macro analysis, which I thought was really fascinating and strange at the same time, because it's almost as if your book points towards that kind of methodology in different ways. It's also reminiscent to me of, like, I don't know if you guys have seen Ted Underwood's work, When Literary Periods Mattered. His final chapter on there, where he starts talking about the fact that we think of these of a single book or a single moment as a kind of punctuating a period, rather than these sort of smooth gradations in terms of historical change. So just sort of coming off of what James was talking about in terms of how what does it mean to read, and what tools do we use, and what's the material infrastructure of that.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, one answer would be, and I suspect it would be some of their answers would be, like, distant reading is the answer to this method. And I'm not completely convinced of that. I mean, it does certain things, and I think what we've been talking about does other things, both of which are required to actually understand these things. But what I'm really keenly interested in, and hearing more about, if anybody has anything to say about it, and we might not, is that relationship between text mediation and space. It's very hard for me. There's all sorts of ways in which I try to imagine the space that texts and the distribution networks that create them occupy. But it's very hard for me to think about it without then going to a text, not in a distant reading fashion, but in a close reading fashion, and finding representations of those distribution networks and that infrastructure. And maybe there's a better method, and maybe this is one of the things that we're actually trying to just determine here via reading Evan's book. But it seems to me that's a really primary question as all of us keep talking about space and what readers do with trying to imagine themselves in space and in time.
I just want to, go ahead.
No, sorry, you go ahead.
I've spoken enough.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to jump off from James's comment about the prominence of popularity in this analysis and its relationship to space. I don't know how coherent this is, but three things. Number one, the best account I can think of the influence and distribution networks that move texts across space is, of course, Katie Trumpner's Bardic Nationalism, which I know is a text that plays a prominent role in this one. Second thing, of course, popularity is and influence is an offshoot of popularity is the major reason for the selection of these texts, and it's one of the things that makes the account compelling is that books are for readers, and we know that these books were actually read and have continued to be read. I just am fascinated, though, since I noticed the prominence of narrative, the connection between narrative and popularity, and global popularity, you know, the influence of the Scottish Enlighteners on American political thought, the influence of Scott's and Byron's poetry on European thought. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, genre and popularity or form and popularity is something to be worth exploring more. And the third thing that sort of jumps off from that for me is thinking about William Sinclair's reading nation in the Romantic period and his insistence that, in fact, a lot of what was read was old books that continue to be printed. So these are the popular new books, but how does that sit against the old books that continue to be read and to be popular, and how might those forms play into this conversation? It seems to me there's a lot to think about here that this book has made available to us.
And some answers to those questions really have to do with space and travel. I've been looking at records of the Madras library, the presidency of Madras and the library, and what they have there and how it's been evolving. And it's actually pretty fascinating. I mean, a lot of it corresponds to what we would think of as a developing canon in the 18th century, but a lot of it doesn't. It's deeply idiosyncratic, and it has a lot to do with the particular, like, so what popularity is really matters depending on who you are and where you are. You know, Persian texts, for example, are extremely popular there in a way that seems really local and unique to those maybe European readers who themselves are in kind of transits back and forth, oceanic transits, between what we now think of as India and Britain. So, and this comes back to one of the points I was making in my overall comments at the beginning. How precise do we need to get about these kinds of transits, networks, affiliations, popularities, all of these different things? I mean, we can get to a very granular level very quickly in a way. I think we're all comfortable with that. Moving between those different scales of reading, our own reading, and our own method, I think is really important.
Yeah, on the question of scales, Miranda and I, in fact, co-chaired a MLA panel last year with some fabulous papers, and so this is on precisely the question of scalar romanticism, not scaly romanticism, and so clearly, you know, yeah, James, you're right. This is on many people's minds, especially given, as Roger was saying, the alternative to sort of the textual analysis even that pays any attention at all to the contents of books as readers read them narratively or otherwise, and instead engages in the distant reading, which I'm not opposed to court. But certainly, I never imagined anyone reading Jocker's book in at the same time as mine, and yet I'm glad to hear that potentially that they're in some ways at least complementary, and as opposed to utterly at odds with each other. Just for a moment to come back to what Miranda was suggesting about the implicit characterological theory in the book that is not worked out. Yeah, I mean, I guess, I was working with a relatively straightforward view of what characters are for and what readers do with them, and a view that I guess if I were going to defend, I would probably look to some of Scott's own comments on what he thought his readers were doing and what he intended his readers to do with his books, in order to make a relatively naive defense of that. But I'm certainly I like very much the idea of thinking more closely about that, and I wonder if that though doesn't then become at odds with distant reading. I mean, is it possible to do macro analysis and yet remain sensitive to the variety of ways in which narrative features do and don't operate? Seems to me that one of the problems with macro analysis is itself the perhaps uncritical assumptions that it makes about, and I know that Katie Trumpeter and Franco Moretti had this argument in print not too long ago. All of which just and I suppose maybe this is just my nature, that I tend to be relatively promiscuous with my theoretical approaches rather than committed to one methodology or theory over another.
I just wanted to mention one thing. So yeah, I totally get that critique of distant reading, particularly as it's articulated by Moretti. I think Jockers is kind of a, and it was funny. I actually only read this because I'm about to teach it in a class, so it just happened to be that I was reading them both at the same time. Jockers tends to be kind of ambivalent about that question. On some ways, he toes the kind of Moretti line, and in others, he tries to say that macroanalysis can be one way of zeroing in on a specific text that you look at in detail. And then you have people like Ted Underwood, who argues that, probably more in line with what James was talking about, this notion of kind of different scales of reading and of coming to terms with like different ways of thinking about it. But it was kind of fascinating to me because, like, it seems like that final part where you were talking about Nussbaum very much sort of has this kind of ethical dimension to it, right? We read these books so we know how to be good global citizens. And it is sort of a question, I think, because I think oftentimes in English departments we make those kinds of claims that this is sort of an ethical discipline, and yet we seem to be sort of going in our own research, sort of going in these sort of different directions that may or may not be compatible with that kind of notion. So it's interesting that your book brings up that tension so well.
And this is, I'm going to come back into this conversation and say, but to harken back to Miranda's sort of comment about character, I mean, at the same time, aren't there things that certain genres and certain forms of literature do that really can't be done by others? Again, I'm thinking of your observation, Miranda, that Evan, in your account of romantic globalism, you kept being drawn back to narrative. And I think that maybe cognitive science offers some, would offer also some perspectives there. I mean, there's a reality that narrative, for example, is one of those forms that the human brain finds easier to remember. But more to the point, I think if we're thinking about things that text can do that other forms of media can't, right? I mean, the question of representing interiority and representing how somebody thinks, right? That is something that really, I mean, the novel is the primary medium for. You can try and replicate things on film with voiceovers, etc. It never succeeds to the same degree. And so I think that, and here I'm just echoing really what I've been hearing a number of you saying, which is that whatever answer we arrive at regarding our methodology, it can't be an either or, let's throw this baby out with this bathwater answer, that they're in struggling towards trying to articulate some of the things we see going on in the Romantic period, that some kind of compromise in methodology, some kind of intermingling of strategies is probably going to be the most useful for us. And yes, like I said, I think that if Evan, if you are drawn to narrative and to focusing on character and thinking about these texts modeling or trying to encourage a certain type of global thinking, well, there's probably some formal rationales for that perhaps would be worth looking at and pulling out in more detail.
I just would want to add to that very quickly. I've just been reading the first book of Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, and there's a moment where he says, well, we can never really know another human being in conversation. Only the novelist can show us who a human being really is. Only a novelist can paint the inner life of a character. That's what characters fundamentally are for. I thought that was smart.
So doesn't that also take us back to sympathy, and in a way to the Scottish Enlightenment version of sympathy? And the novel is the most sympathetic form. If you are trying to achieve some kind of global community, then maybe, and you can't go off things like external features and physical resemblance, then maybe the novel is the medium of global community then for some of these authors.
That just leads me to wonder why so. I mean, as an ardent reader of poetry in a period, the 18th century and 18th century studies, that seems to go to great lengths to try to ignore it because of what it is. Why? I mean, why would that be the case? I'm always, whenever we talk about the novel, I'm always very careful to try to separate what seem like the generic and formal features of it, and then the ideology that we've attached to it. Which I think is teleological. It's a sort of retrospective formation, and I think we're all aware of that. We all know that. And yet at the same time, we seem to not be able to resist it. We make the novel do all sorts of things as a matter of form and genre, as if it's built intrinsically into its character, to use that term in a very different valence. And I'm just not sure that's the case. That's why I was really struck, Evan, by your arguments that you, again, I think I'm right about this, that you make them explicit at the end. They're implicit throughout, but you make them explicit at the end, that you're kind of making a generic argument about the Romantic period as well. And I was surprised by that, actually. And I find it to be really intriguing, and I think there's more to that. And so if you feel like saying more about that, and even in particular if I'm misreading, but it seems to me that this has a lot to do with the ideology of genre. And I could be convinced that the novel is this kind of form, this exemplary form for understanding both human interiorities in a vast global space. But I don't see any reason why poetry wouldn't be able to do that. It might be a historical accident that it didn't happen, and I'd be convinced of that. But I don't see anything in the form, necessarily. I mean, it's so capacious, just as the novel is, by the early 19th century, that it does seem, it would be an interesting question to me if we decide that the novel is the vehicle that makes this happen, why the novel is the vehicle that makes this happen, and why poetry couldn't be. Because I don't see anything natural about that per se.
Yeah, I don't think that...
Sorry, just to give an example, maybe this would be a way to think of it in terms of a case study. I also sort of would wonder where Wordsworth is in this, because he seems to be kind of the figure who could offer kind of maybe a different model of sympathy or globality. Maybe, I don't know. Go, Evan, go.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, well, I mean, I do think that there could have been a place for Wordsworth, and I see he shows up just very sporadically. I think David Simpson's recent book on Wordsworth, of course, makes claims around the sort of ethics of his representations, and so I'm inclined to agree with James. If there's something about narrative that made these works popular, and I thought Miranda's formulation there was really helpful. Then I don't think that the narrative needs to be confined to one genre, and so poetic narratives, which of course are not particularly popular any longer, but were in a society and in a readerly culture that was still invested in the cultural authority of poetry. Obviously Byron's verse romances and Scott's verse romances were as popular for a time with readers as anything that was being done by the novelists. So maybe it's a question of narrative as a mode rather than one particular genre here that's more capable of doing some kind of work. I just wanted to say in response to James about the book's conclusion. It had it originally featured a even more pugnacious conclusion that even, I believe, had bullet points in it. I had been reading a lot of Badiou at the time, and I think got carried away with the idea that I was going to, sort of lay out the lessons. And an early reader, a reader of the book I still don't know who this reader was when the book was actually originally with a different press, I should say, whose main complaints about the book tended to be that this reader simply wanted it to be a post-colonial book. And so ultimately it was not going to fly. But and while I disagreed with them about that, they were quite right. They really took issue with the original conclusion to the book that was way too pedantic, and sort of laid out a program based on sort of how we could alter our present worldview and our present global imaginary based on a sort of return to some of these romantic formulations that I was suggesting have gotten buried, by the weight of imperial history. So the world was probably better off without that particular conclusion. However, if you want to, if I could pass it along to you in private if you want to see what you were spared.
I'm curious about something. I don't want to take us away from the really interesting line of thought that we've been pursuing, but and again, this is very selfish because I'm thinking about this as well. I'm really I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but I am that a reader said this book needs to be more post-colonial, and I'd be curious to know what that is. I mean, I think there is a way in which post-colonial theory is at a moment where it's trying to come to some sense of what it means now to pursue post-colonialism and all its different, again, as a method, as a mode of scholarship, not as a means of political engagement, but really as an academic method, as a mode of scholarship. So maybe there is some trouble and some turbulence in that, but I don't see why there has to be. So I'm very interested that a reader said, well, this needs to be more post-colonial. What would that mean? Like, what's the absence here? I mean, I know you yourself have said, I want to change some of the dynamics away from colonialism and imperialism, but that seems like that's within the post-colonial mode of theory. I don't see what the reluctance is.
Well, from this reader's perspective, from what I can recall, globalization needs to be seen as colonial domination by other means, right? And that is of course typically the left-wing view of it. And as I said from the outset, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that claim as far as it's a mode of understanding globalization today, right? As being simply sort of Western domination by soft power means. Rather than full-on occupation. However, my goal throughout, and I don't mean to be overly repetitive here, but what I kept trying to explain to this reader was that I was trying to recover a moment and a frame of mind that I saw romantic authors trying to promulgate that what maybe wasn't visible to us any longer and wouldn't be visible through a purely post-colonial frame. Like Magdisi's romantic imperialism, that there was an alternative to that view of globalization, as simply, the continued dominance of Europe and the West by other means. And I should note that Magdisi, of course, as many of you know, has himself somewhat modified his own views with his most recent book, Making England. What's the title of it? Making England Western. Shoot, I thought I had it here. I pulled out the wrong one. at any rate, you know, what continues to be problematic for me is that frame that assumes that the Romantics were always already imperial, you know, and that their mindset was one of straightforward imperialism, and that even though that simply doesn't seem to match up with the facts as historians are reviewing them. So I think that's, you know, I mean, I agree with you. This book, while it presents a different paradigm from Romantic imperialism, doesn't suggest, and I hope, you know, shouldn't be read as suggesting that post-colonialism, you know, should be junked. Not at all. But I'm still waiting to see what the you know, if there are some out there who feel that the book is overly naive in some way, right? I mean, I imagine that that's the critique it's going to get from a sort of more committed post-colonialist methodology, that I'm being naive about the British Empire here, and that it doesn't matter if, you know, technically there was no such thing in the early 19th century. It was there in everybody's minds. I guess we'll wait and see, but I'm certainly glad to hear that that's, you know, not the only way of reading it, because that's not what I intended.
I'd just like to say I think that your account of Scott, and also to some extent of Byron, is an incredibly compelling way to make that case. I mean, the close reading of the late Scott, which so few of us have read. I haven't read either of the books that you close read in this chapter. I'll put my cards on the table. What you seem to be suggesting is, if in fact we attended more to these kinds of texts, we might see the history of global thought in the Romantic period very differently. And again, the Byron too. You don't maybe take forward the queer implications of the impossibility that Byron seems to be identifying in Lara. But if you were to do so, that would lead to yet another alternative history of this mode of thought in the period.
I loved your suggestion of the queer globalism and combining that with Edelman's work. I hope somebody does that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say then, just to add some more, Miranda, to what you were just saying, I don't know those works either, but you can see the way in which, Evan, what you were running up against, and I think you will get a bit of that response. I'm really hopeful that you won't get a lot. That certainly wouldn't be my response. But I think we can see the way in which conclusions that have happened, particularly in the 1990s, in post-colonial theory that were extremely useful, have now actually acted to distort method and archive. So we have conclusions that we have to buttress. So that means, even an example of someone who's so fabulously well known as Walter Scott, you know, we have portions of the archive that we just don't pay any attention to because they just don't fit as well into the sort of preordained conclusions that we have. So forget, you know, manuscripts in the British Library that haven't even been read that might show the real complexities and variegations of these debates, you know, throughout imperialism. And that's not just to say, like, oh, there was anti-colonialism and anti-imperial thought in 18th and 19th century Britain. We all know there was, and we can debate about its prominence or not. But I think it's even gone further than that. We've gotten to the point where we actually are misusing and distorting the archive because we just don't have a sense of how to access it correctly. And we've decided that there's things out there that just aren't evidence, or they're just not adequately evidence because they don't fit within these modes of logic. So I think that's one of the things that hopefully will be a happy conclusion for this book.
All right. Well, this has been a really great conversation. Does anyone have sort of final thoughts or statements that they want to make?
Yes, I want to say thank you again to all of you. I mean, this is just fabulously productive, and I mean, you know, we all know that it's a thrill to have anyone read our work, much less to have three scholars and whom I really admire give such vivid and thought-provoking accounts of it. And then let me just say, on behalf of all of us, I think again, thank you to Roger for pioneering this new form of meeting. This felt to me as stimulating as attending a seminar at a conference or a panel, and yet I did it from the comfort of my own basement. So I really just can't say thank you enough.
Yeah, same here. Thank you, Roger, and it was wonderful to hear from everyone.
And I'm going to echo that. Thank you so much for arranging this. And Evan, again, I love the book, and thank you for being bold enough to venture into this conversation with us. I'm glad you did.
I'll just add my thanks as well. And Evan, thank you for the book and the opportunity to talk about it in this detailed way.
And I'll add my final thanks to all of you, because you know, this is a totally different kind of format, and when I first thought about doing something like this, I was really concerned that scholars might be a little reticent to try out something new, but it's been really great conversation. Surely made my day and my week, and I think this will be a really great thing to start out the new Romantic Circles reviews. So thank you very much. See you later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.